Hello, and welcome to the Charm Citizen Show. I'm your host, the Charm City Maven, and today I am here with Lawrence Grandpre of Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. How are you doing today, Lawrence?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me.
Yes, yes. I'm so happy to have you on here. Of course, I love LBS and I love what you guys are doing. I feel like every time I talk to you guys, I want to open it up by starting way back and talk about debate.
hmm
'Cause you have your roots in debate as well, correct?
Yeah. No, I joined debate my sophomore year of high school, so that would have been 2000, 2001. There was a movement around the nation to bring debate to inner city schools, funded by George Soros, who now is the right-wing boogeyman, but he's a Hungarian American financier who had a large foundation called Open Society Foundation. And the
Mhm.
idea was that this form of debate called policy debate is a two-person form of debate, one topic for the whole country. So you can have young people talk about policy from a research-based perspective, two-person, so they have to learn cooperation skills. But it was really only ever thought of as like as a literacy, attendance, and almost like a conflict mediation program. There was never any thought to bringing these poor young Black kids into a community that was extremely elite, defined by like obsession with like promoting American foreign policy, American war fighting, thinking for with the lens for all policy analysis. So we would talk about racism. The white kids would say spending money on racism collapses the economy, leads to nuclear war. Nuclear war outweighs racism, and we would lose. Because the judges were trained to see that argument as more persuasive than racism is bad, do something about it. So that was a stylistic and political intervention into community by Black elders, especially at the Pan African Studies Department at the University of Louisville, to bring what you could call critical race theory, Black aesthetics, spoken word, hip hop into community to critique debate itself. So it's not just debate, but debating about debate, debating how we judge debate, debating how elite white kids come into community and use these stylistic tricks to avoid conversation about their privilege and real issues impacting real students in debate. So our group is an extension of using that lens to evaluate policy because our opponents will literally go to DC and work at think tanks, which are, institutions which think up policy, help lawmakers write policy for lawmakers, give them bills that advance an agenda, cut taxes, decrease regulation. Think about Reagan, think about Project 2025. Those come from think tanks. And there was no one doing anything like that for working class Black people for their interests. So we call ourselves a think tank. We're not a nonprofit, so we can do direct political engagement. And we think of what we do as more of like a political organizing intervention into what think tanks do. So we do research, we work with lawmakers, we write policy, but we push bills from a reflection of engaging community and building with the community we grew up with, seeing the needs, seeing what they're already doing, the assets already in community, and using our research and advocacy skills to magnify whether it's community-based violence prevention, whether it's getting money to organizations that work with youth from a grassroots perspective. It's really about using the think tank model and research model to plug into community and see the assets already there rather than to hurt community or believe that we have to find some tools outside the community to come in and save community.
Yes. Thank you for that intro. You've educated me a lot on, well, one, the history. I didn't even know that it was a Soros connection. But
hmm
moving forward and talking about what LBS does is a think tank and an advocacy organization that is rooted in the community. What you're saying is absolutely true. I mean, I have been able to call on you as an advocate for even stressful things that have happened inside of my own community that I have been directly negatively affected by. And it really is, I think that probably before you all, the conversation about think tanks in general wasn't something that everyday people that I talk to even consider. And I don't necessarily know that we need to have that language to talk about the people who we look to as leaders in our community to actually serve us in the political space. So that's what you all have done, and I definitely want to say thank you for that because it's been you guys have been accessible in so many ways. Being able to call you, but also how you translate uh, the issues that we actually face from a political perspective and then downright to the community. Can you talk about what civic engagement looks like in this contemporary fashion?
Yeah, so civic engagement's often boiled down to, did you vote? Um,
Mhm.
are you talking about the elected officials? Are you promoting the bills that Democrats push? And one of the things that I think that I say is that we as a community do a variety of things that really are civic engagement, but they don't fit within the model that we're given to see what good civic engagement is. So, for example, every barbershop is a think tank, right? Every barbershop
Mm-hmm.
you go into, people are talking about the issues that impact their lives and saying what people need to do is X, Y, Z. And that usually is not what we need to do is go support the Democrats, even though some people say that. It is, Joe Biden supported the crime bill. We need to hold him accountable. We need to figure out how to make these people do something that deals with the fact that it was Democratic mayors that unleashed the war on drugs, that unleashed mass arrests in our community. We need to figure out how to make them, they should give us some reparations for that. So when we do reparations for the war on drugs, we saw they were going to legalize cannabis. It's like, okay, when you legalize cannabis, you put an extra tax on it. It normally just goes to the state budget and they do whatever with it. But it's like the war on weed in the 90s drove mass incarceration in the 90s. Like it was literally like a war on weed, locking people up for weed. And looking at the communities most impacted by that, like you can't have people making millions of dollars off cannabis and not repair the harm to the communities that were impacted by the war on weed.
Mm-hmm.
So I think having those visions of civic engagement brings people in, but also, not voting is a civic choice, is a form of civic engagement. Talking about like all the evils that the politicians do is a form of civic engagement. And as opposed to pathologizing it, our job is to build policy agendas and arguments that can appeal to people who very logically have a skepticism and in some ways well-founded disdain for the political institutions that use our suffering as a hustle, basically, whether it's a hustle to get
Mm-hmm.
votes or a hustle to get grant money, nonprofits claiming to do work and save us, but really just being a jobs program for certain people being parasitic upon our community. Like people are right to be skeptical of that. But that's not a reason to not do anything. It's to build systems like we're doing with the reparations fund or the work we did with the Baltimore City Children and Youth Fund to build less extractive and more community rooted models that people can see the benefit to their community. Even though nothing is perfect when you're dealing with politics, people seeing the difference and seeing change builds the political base for more deeper interventions. So when we did the youth fund, people saw people getting money who typically didn't get money. So the hope is that as we do the reparations fund, or as we push other policies we'd like to talk about, that builds the base of political support needed to get those policies enforced and defended as people who are enemies to our community come and attack them, right? So it really is the job of making the impossible possible by honoring the civic discourse and engagement of people who have typically been ignored or denigrated as not political in the right ways or even not political at all or anti-political. When the reality is the people in the barbershop saying voting is for suckers, they have a legitimate argument. Even though it doesn't match up with what the Democrats call civic engagement, those folks are civically influential. And you at the very least need to respect those folks, engage them, and build a political agenda that if they don't fully support it, they can respect it.
Yeah. I think a lot of it is that radical Black thought, which you do hear in Black spaces, is not seen as civic engagement because it's too radical, it's too far left, and not in the leftist speak that I guess like a lot of white people use, but in
Hmm.
the leftist way that that Black people talk about politics and exist in the everyday how do I want to call it, the political systemic pressure that is like my whole life is political. It's like
Hmm.
it's something that I can't divorce myself of. Systemic pressures, systemic barriers play a literal everyday part in just about everything that I do, from where I live to where I see where I live at. Like even you talking about the youth fund. Can you actually say more about the work that you all did with that?
Yeah, so in 2015, people in Baltimore will know that was the year the Freddie Gray thing happened, the uprising, the protests. Then City
Mhm.
Council President Jack Young said we gotta do something for the youth. So he put a bill in that would take a percentage of the property taxes people pay locally, I think it's 3%, and put it in a fund explicitly for youth programming. And that had to go before the voters to get voted on. And it did. Um, I believe it's 2018, right? So when it happened, the fear and the momentum was that a typical large nonprofit would basically be given the money to manage it and they would just have a typical grant making process and give it out to folks doing work with youth. But the problem with that is that if you're looking at the communities impacted by the Baltimore uprising, there are a lot of people doing work that never got paid, don't have 501c3, maybe never got a grant, don't have an auditor, don't have an accountant, but there are people in community, we need to build their capacity to get the money because those are the people who can actually work with the youth who were in the streets in 2015. But that requires a very intentional vision to do the work to shift the way we think of what is a good bet when you're giving out grant money. The typical model says you need to have already gotten money from the state. You need to have 3 years of audited financial statements. You need to have a methodology or program backed by research from a major university. But we know the universities don't value the indigenous, cultural, spiritual methodologies from our community, so they're not studying those. So just
Hmm.
because you don't have a research study from a major university, in fact, that probably means you might be on to a good track in our vision, right? Because most of what they
Right.
produce is from a Eurocentric, often deficit-based model. So the idea with the youth fund is like we did political advocacy, and there was a work group convened. Our then CEO Adam was the co-chair of the work group with a guy named John Brothers who worked for a large foundation in the city. And the recommendations were we need to hold it at a black institution, but not just hold it at a black institution, but to build it with a model of building capacity for organizations who use the history and cultural resources of community as the method of how they do their work, and who typically don't get large foundational public money. The institution should be built from the ground up to prefer those institutions and do the work to build their capacity to get the money. So
Hmm.
we started off it being housed under Associated Black Charities. And folks like us and other folks like Daniel Terrain were brought in as consultants to build a model that had community-based grant review teams that used criteria that centered on sort of a culturally affirming language and sort of a vision of, again, preferring smaller grassroots organizations, preferring orgs that collaborated on grants rather than competing on grants. And that eventually scaled up into it being an independent institution as it is now, that's taken some of that DNA from its founding and has scaled up to become, a permanent, independent, quasi-public entity that yearly gives out around $10 million with the most diverse, i.e., the most Black people in their portfolio of any major foundation in the city, right? So even
Is
though but we don't have a formal relationship with the youth fund anymore, the work that they're doing still reflects a vision of them giving money to Black organizations, many of whom would not typically or did not typically get grant money. So I think it's an example of institutions building a solid DNA, even when we were no longer there, them having the ability to reflect, not perfectly, but reflecting that fundamental vision in ways that got money to people on the ground who typically did not get money.
is just for clarity for my sake, and is this what is now the BCYF, the Baltimore Children Youth Fund?
Yes, that is the BCYF, yes.
Okay.
Which is distinct
Yes.
from what we're
Uh,
working on now, which is the Community Reparations and Repair Fund Commission, which is basically an attempt to use a similar model, but with a more expansive lens of using the tax revenue from legal cannabis sales at a statewide level to have local control of that money and to build out, similarly, around a $10 million a year reparations fund, which would invest money in communities impacted by the war on drugs, right? So that's the idea. One victory gives you experience political capital to build out another institution, and hopefully they can work in synergy to begin to improve conditions in our community.
and what you said, it essentially still takes years to do, still takes many of people a lot of collaborations and still a lot of like actual capital. Um, that yeah, the average person does not have that.
E-
Especially if you are boots on the ground working with youth. I mean, I know myself as a mom. I'm literally working with the youth that is in my household. So even
mhm,
I have my role to play, but I don't have that same type of reach. There's no study that's going to come back, 20 years from now and say that I did right. Besides my children saying you did great, mom.
mhm,
I mean, I do bring that up. I say it in jest, but I do bring it up because I think as we talk about helping like youth in communities, what I always say is that it always seems like moms seem to be out of this conversation, and which to me is crazy because it goes into
mhm,
how we actually the lens that we see village making and the collaboration. There's a mother does nothing but collaborate with the community, and I so
mhm,
wish that we were seen as the is the bedrock of a civic model that we actually are because we're shaping both the hearts and the minds and the ethos and literally put in putting shirts on children's backs and trying to usher in the next generation in a way that most people would want.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think that moms get lip service, but what often happens is a more parasitic um relationship to that organic function. So nonprofits
Mhm.
and political folks sweep into community, and when they need someone to go in front of the cameras, they get the mothers. Especially when it's time
Yes.
to like pass a bill that's going to lock up more kids for like, doing knuckleheaded stuff and being kids. They get mothers with like, my child was a victim of this crime. I gotta listen to the mothers, XYZ. And that's not to denigrate the real pain people experience in that moment, but whether it's a nonprofit that strategically uses a smattering of Black women to be the face of the nonprofit when the whole institutional model is run from the top by people not from our community, or it's by people pushing tough on crime legislation, which is really pathologizing our youth, you're not actually investing in the leadership of people in the community to reflect their own vision of how to deal with these problems. Right. So I think when we talk about building institutional capacity for Black community to take care of itself. I think a lot of the reality is if Black mothers were the center of our human social service ecosystem, there would be a lot of white institutions that would go out of business. There'd be a lot of white researchers that would have to go through Black mothers and Black community to do their research. And that's just very inconvenient for people who have a lot invested in a vision of Black people as wanting to civilize them and also running these multi-million-dollar nonprofits in a way that reflects what powerful white people think can help keep our community stable, i.e., keep our communities under control. So this whole
Mhm.
vision of a nonprofit industrial complex is a fancy term, but I think it's something most people intuitively understand, where that all the money they say go to our community, but it doesn't seem to get much better. But to kind of wrap up, we have a historic decline in murders in the city. And I
Yeah.
think one thing that no individual entity can take credit for all of it, but there's been 15 years of conversation from folks like us to say these folks in community that have credible voice and have been doing work trying to save people and rebuild community. How about you just give them money? And out of their desperation over the past few years when murders have been so high, I think the political leaders have been forced to start giving some of those people money that they've typically not been given money before. Now there are strings attached. They give a bunch of other people money that we don't necessarily love. But if you're looking at what has changed, what have we done over the past 5 years that we did not do the previous 50 years that can account for a massive over 50% decline in murders? I think it is giving money to grassroots violence prevention institutions that include, um, you know, Baltimore Sisters, Baltimore Brothers, We Are Us, Uncle T, Peace Team, Aziz Peace, um, all of these different grassroots organizations. Some of them explicitly call themselves violence prevention. Some of them just claim to be working with youth, mentoring. But there's an increasing ecosystem of investment in an ecosystem of institutions, be it the youth fund, be
Mhm.
it federal money, that I think has produced something community has seen that cannot be denied, which is a fundamentally different environment when it comes to murders at the very least than it was 5, even 3 years ago. And I think it is building on those successes that we hope to be sure we get the credit for it, because the police and the nonprofit industrial complex is trying to steal our credit for the work that we did even before there was a paycheck involved, right? And we need to be very clear to claim that victory and reject the cynicism that says that it was only when people saw value in us from the outside that change happened. No, we saw value in ourselves and we invested in ourselves. And that's what is beginning to turn the tide when it comes to murders in our city.
Yes, and not just murders, but I would say, like, the overall well-being of the city, the overall health of the city. I'll say that I feel I have noticed a palpable change, in the city. It's not without its issues, of course. I mean, this is a city after all, but I think that I have felt a change. But what about you, Lance? Do you feel like there has been, that the city has gotten better? Yes, I do want your honest take.
Well, I just want to be as precise as I can be. It's hard
Mhm,
because better is, I don't define progress based solely upon the scale of pathology. So when you look at 350
mhm,
murders versus 250 versus 150, not only is it all objectively too high from a moral standpoint, all of it is still higher than other comparable cities in America. So it's one of those things that we want to recognize that we are improving on key metrics, but never accept what is not normal. Even at 150 murders, it's still way higher than Boston. It is way higher than other comparable cities that we need to sort of recognize and denormalize violence, period, 300 was always a ridiculously high number to see as the metric for success. It never made any sense, right? But maybe the
Yeah.
metric is 100, maybe the metric is 50. But but the point is, when it comes to the civic fabric of the community, I see that as expanding. I see what Tendaya is doing now that they're getting money to escort youth and have cadet programs. I see what the Baltimore Rites of Passage initiative is doing incorporation ceremonies for men and youth going through African Center Rites of Passage. I see what Baltimore Sisters is doing, Baltimore Brothers, We Are Us. Um, I'm seeing just so many things that are productive, but it's important that we not judge our community success on pathology prevention, but the active investment in conditions of flourishing and creativity and wholeness in our community, right? So I want to
I
see
agree.
more investments in leadership programming. We've been trying to do debate stuff for like 10 years, but it's just hard because we're so busy doing other stuff. I'd love to see like more artistic programming, more debate programming, more leadership programming, more STEM programming. I see what like the Black Robot Project and Brother Jason is doing. Like I'd like to see we got some capoeira stuff, but I'd like to see more capoeira Angola stuff, right? That's more tied to the African diasporic resistance tradition as opposed to just doing flips and stuff, right? So there's so much more
Mhm.
stuff that we can do to invest in our civic cultural fabric. The city is clearly changing. It never stops changing. And the one thing I do see is I see more homes being rehabbed. Like I see less vacants. And that is good, but it also could be a sign of a shift towards a more expensive housing market. More gentrification pressure seems to be coming to Baltimore, right?
Mhm.
And that's
True.
dangerous, right? They have billions of dollars planned to invest in the city over the next 5 to 10 years. So in some ways, what can be look like getting better could lead to worse in terms of political power and stability for our people. Like downtown's going to be a lot shinier 5 years from now. They're going to be less bandos 5 years from now. But it also might mean housing could be more expensive. There could be more foreclosures. There could be more evictions. There could be more people moving to our city because the politics all over the country is so toxic that people coming from Texas and other red states because they see Baltimore is safe. And that's going to bump up the price of housing. But if you're not a homeowner or you've got to pay that property tax, that's going to be something you got to deal with. Our city is diversifying. I think that's generally good. We've been a black white city for a very long time. But as we are
Mhm.
diversifying, we need to recognize that Latinx, Latina populations are very diverse. Some of them are very right wing, like escaping left wing dictatorships. Some of them are very left wing, escaping right wing dictatorships. Some of them are black, some of them are anti black, right? So we need to
Mhm.
recognize that as we diversify, we as a black community are going to have to take seriously what it means to live in a triracial city, black, white, and Latina, in a way that could dilute political power but also can have a black brown alliance that deals with some of the conservative democratic white power that has dominated this city in subtle ways for a long time. So we're
Mhm.
evolving and changing in very interesting and important ways. And I think that that should be embraced rather than, there's small segments of our community, and I want to say small, that are like, the Latina folks are taking our jobs. Like I believe in immigration enforcement. Like we need to recognize that the violence coming for them is literally the same violence coming for us, right? The same vision these people are not productive and worthless that leads to us being put in jail puts them in immigration detention camps to get them exported. The same people trying to steal their wages and use them to undercut black labor. They don't care about black labor. Why do you think they're using them to undercut us, right? So it's just
Right.
one of those things that we need to have a stronger vision about how to build a future of Baltimore that takes the change and makes it something we control, whether it's cooperative housing, funding for housing co-ops, a land bank that's funded by an anti-gentrification frame. Like we have a city that we can preserve to be somewhat affordable on the East Coast, but we have to act now to preserve that future because it's going to potentially come very fast in terms of gentrification pressure when people realize Baltimore's the only city left on the East Coast that hasn't been like gentrified to the hilt and there's money to be made in the housing market. Right now, we're
Mhm.
still a little bit ghetto for Wall Street, and that actually protects us from the gentrification in some ways. But that could change very quickly. That could change very, very fast. And we have to be ready for the political forces selling that to us as liberation, selling that to us as Baltimore's renaissance, when really it could mean more policing in order to secure the real estate and just more
Mhm.
gentrification pressure. So we gotta be careful what we wish for. Because when people say Baltimore Renaissance, that historically has come with like mass arrests from people like O'Malley and mass um stealing of resources from community and putting it into where capital wants the resources like what Schaefer did. So we just
Mhm.
got to recognize that history and build the political power to secure a future for us and our people that actually reflects our vision of what we want our future to be.
Do you think that housing is one of the bigger issues that people should put a focus on?
In a word, yeah, like every almost every city when you talk to people says, I wish we would have paid attention to housing 5 or 10 years before we did. Because by the time we started paying attention to housing, it was too late. Like, talk to people in New York, talk to people in Philly, talk to people in a bunch of cities. They said the housing market got out of control so fast, we were reactive.
Yeah.
Even look at like our Black radical tradition, like Harold Cruz wrote a book called Crisis of the Negro Intellectual, where he said that the Black arts community in Harlem, the so-called Black arts movement in the 60s, um, were so busy appealing to the white gaze because they wanted to get white people to patronize their art so they can make a living. They were not reflecting the political needs of the community, which at the time was securing the future of Harlem as a affordable black community. So the gentrification
Mhm.
of Harlem that happens, you know, black folks could have been on that in the 50s and 60s, building art and community power to more centrally make that a central issue. But you don't just lose housing, you lose the cultural ability to have an arts community to reflect your interests and your visions of the world. And you lose the ability to use that arts community as a political tool to push back against white power. So when you see like the Black Arts District, when you see, you know, Mama Coco's and this incubation of like Black arts in Baltimore, Black artists don't have nowhere else to live, right? So affirming affordability here could really help secure not just Black community, but the Black arts community articulating a vision of a future for the city that is affordable. Um, like so much of your community gets destabilized when you have to move, whether it's because you're being arrested, or because you can't afford to live in your historic community no more. Whether your grandma
Mhm.
dies and you know you lose the home because you didn't have a will. So looking at people like Fight Black Be More and the work they're doing to deal with people getting losing their houses from water bills and protecting people in terms of tangled title and not having wills, so much of this communal disruption is going to undermine the stability of our communities. And having a strong focus on permanent affordable housing is going to not just make it so you spend less money on rent, but secure community institutions like the Black grandmothers and the Black mothers who serve as nodes of community stability. When they have to move, when they get gentrified out, the whole community gets destabilized. So it's not just about
Yeah.
housing, it's about what the lack of affordable housing does to community stability, which has real impacts on crime rates and just the sense of communities being communities.
Yeah. So housing is so complex, and I'm living in a community that is, I guess, on the verge of the gentrification that you speak of. There's going to be a lot of investment. I live in Park Heights. There's going to be a lot of investment coming down the pike due to the Pimlico development,
Hmm.
which it's like on one side of the fence is like, no, I don't want the neighborhoods to become gentrified. I don't want to be outpriced out of the neighborhood. But at the same time, this community is from a commercial perspective, there's not a lot available. There's not a lot of ways for me to spend my dollars in my community. If I
Hmm.
wanted to buy paint today, if I wanted to buy literal paint and a paintbrush, I could not do that inside of my community. It's not a place that I could walk to find those what I consider very basic um, uh, necessities for me is not necessarily as the artist. That's not my particular medium, but it is the medium of my children. If we're talking about
Hmm.
expanding the hearts and minds of youth, they one of them still goes to an art based school inside of the Park Heights community, but around that Park Heights community, there is no art supply store.
Hmm.
Which to me is it my frustration becomes that those aren't even the conversations that I can begin to have. I mean, I can advocate using my own platform, but it doesn't seem to be a place where I can actually tell people, no, this is the need. I don't care about Narcan, respectfully. Respectfully. I care about also being able to provide the art supplies to my children when they get a burst of inspiration, which is children. They always have a burst of inspiration. That should be something that's accessible to me. The yoga studios and fitness, wellness, all of those things I do want to bring in my community. But what I do bump up against is we don't want to have those type of conversations of quality of life and at the risk of being gentrified. And I don't know quite
Hmm.
how to unpack that even in the conversations that I have within my community. And
I
much to
remember
what you
going.
well, I was just gonna say much to what you said, because a lot of the conversations are lend themselves to the pathology
Yeah.
the issues that we face in the community when I'm really just trying to be a everyday person, raising an everyday family.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot there. So I would say that a big part of it is political leadership. So if you look at Northwest Baltimore, like that district, the 41st district, is well over 60% black. I think it's actually more like 65 now. But the senator from that
Mhm,
district is white. She's from an Orthodox Jewish political um, dynasty or institution that supports her in ways that allow her to support, tough on crime policies. Like Dahlia Tarr voted to repeal some of the very important protections we had on juvenile justice, youth being put in incarceration, youth being interrogated. And that's a view of the community as pathology to be controlled, rather than as an asset to be invested in. So when we talk about
mhm,
viewing political systems that people can invest in, it's like understanding that there are forces in our community that really determine how resources flow. And if you see the community as something to be socially controlled, as like, we want a buffer zone between the more white parts of Northwest Park Heights, and you see Central Park Heights, very similar to like the West Bank in Israel as like this border colony to be controlled. Like when you saw the brother being chased by that police car, that was in Park Heights.
mhm. Yeah.
So you're not worried about getting paintbrushes in community, and when your political leadership is supporting a police state that wants to occupy community because it sees community as something to be controlled. And I think similarly, the idea is that well, we have to have the police because that's the only way we can secure community to get the property value to go up. But what we're seeing is that there's a massive foreclosure crisis in Baltimore because there were a lot of these exploitative arrangements being done by flippers. So a lot of the value that Park Heights residents saw, a tiny increase in their home values, now it's like leveling out because we don't have the power to have community controlled investments in our community to stabilize our communities as they are. But rather, we have people investing in our communities to flip them into something gentrifiers want them to be, which requires more over tough on policing that pathologizes our community. So when we look at, reparations, not just reparations for the war on drugs, but reparations for redlining, historical housing inequity, housing covenants, like we need to study those things to see like what are the solutions to them. So like when we have this vote potentially next week to overturn the governor's veto of the reparations study bill, it's designed to actually figure out solutions for places like Park Heights that can redirect revenue from institutions that have exploited community to the community to be able to stabilize itself and value the community as it is, not just valuing it as an asset to be flipped into what gentrifiers want it to be. So the last thing I would say is that we're working with a delegate from Northwest Baltimore, Malcolm Ruff, to introduce a bill that would tax the endowments of places like Johns Hopkins because these nonprofits have multi-billion dollars in the bank just sitting there. Their money's making money for them. So Hopkins took Henrietta Alexis cells. They supported, gentrification. Railroad money came from moving goods tied to slavery. That's where Johns Hopkins got his money was the railroads. Had slaves were forced to work on those railroads during the Civil War. And that's where Hopkins' money comes from. And if you have a vision that says we're not just going to accept them giving us a few million as a voluntary payment in lieu of taxes, but no, you have 13 billion in the bank. If you give us 2% of that in taxes per year and direct it to Park Heights, you'll be able to have permanent affordable housing. You'll have the money to invest in arts institutions and not just one library that the mayor is building, but just a ecosystem of institutions that serve community. You need to have capital flowing to that. And you have political leaders that resist that because they believe in Hopkins, they believe in gentrification, they believe in tough on crime, and you have political leaders willing to fight and stand up and resist things like the pathologization of our community and willing to stand up to Hopkins and stand up to foundations that got their money from blockbusting and taking black property and taking white property and charging black people for it because segregation meant there was nowhere else they could move. So giving those institutions to actually pay their fair share in taxes, like Delegate Ruff is doing, will be a much better solution for that community than what Dahlia Tarr has been traditionally tied to as a political network, not just an individual, but a network that says policing, the market, gentrification is the best y'all can hope for. So we need to buy
Mhm.
into black people buying into that political vision for our community, but that's just going to lead to more people getting chased by cops because that's what that leads to.
Right. So we're going into the next legislative session in January. You talked about getting the veto overturned from Westmore. What else is on LBS's legislative agenda?
But
hmm
in order to get a new leader for the House of Delegates, they need to by law, take up all the things that were vetoed last session. So next week, it is
Okay.
probable that they're going to actually vote on whether the lawmakers in the state capital of Annapolis are going to override the things that the governor vetoed last year. So he vetoed a bunch of things, but including in that is the bill that would create a study commission for not just the harms of slavery, but specifically how to have solutions for those harms. Like the point of that study bill was not just to study how evil white people were and how racism exists. Like we do have some studies that say that. It was explicitly to
Mhm.
focus on solutions to that historical inequity. So it's like, if we're going to tax Hopkins, how do we do it? What should be the tax rate? What would be the economic impact of it? How much money did Hopkins benefit from Henrietta Lacks' cells? How much do they owe us for the gentrification? We don't have answers to that. It'd be really good to have a
Mhm.
study to show that, to build the political support necessary for the reparative policies our community needs. And that vote could happen next week. So if you're interested, please go to lbsbaltimore.com and tell your lawmaker you support them overriding the governor's veto, right? Because the governor is making this argument we don't need a study, he's already doing stuff. And it's like, well, he should have no problem then studying how to do more and studying how to do more beyond the limits of what the political establishment will accept, but actually doing things like taxing Hopkins and actually building the support to do transformative policies rather than just working within the very limited frame of just being a traditional Democratic governor, which he has done some good things within that framework, but reparations is not that. Reparations is expanding that framework. So the community harmed by the bad thing has the power to choose for themselves the solutions that will fix the problem. It's not just one person at the top picking good stuff he think would help. That's not reparations, right? So on
Mhm.
top of that, just to kind of wrap up, we're working to end the automatic charging of useless adults. So in Maryland, for over 30 charges, if you're under 18, you're automatically put in the adult system where there's less support in terms of education and services. Many people are housed in adult facilities where they're kept sight and sound away from adult offenders, which sounds good because you don't want adults doing bad stuff to kids in prison. But it's basically oftentimes solitary confinement. And that creates sort of psychological isolation that can lead to people being more traumatized and actually having a harder time readjusting when they get out. And many of those folks are actually waived down to the juvenile system anyway. So they're just languishing in adult prisons for sometimes, 6, 12, 18, 24 months, just waiting to be waived down to the juvenile system. And all that time, they're not getting the services they need to actually reintegrate into community. So starting them in the adult facility is the adults in the juvenile system would be a much better framework for juvenile justice. And I mentioned the taxing of endowments. That's going to be a bill that we're going to put in to actually tax institutions that have endowments over like 1 or 2 billion and have that money actually go to reparations. So if the governor wants to act on reparations, we're going to give him a bill that can actually act in the immediate term to raise really probably a 9 figures per year that would go to communities impacted by slavery and systemic inequity. We have a few other bills. I'm not going to, they're more technical. So go to our
Mhm.
website, lbsbaltimore.com, and check out our legislative agenda for 2025. We're doing a lot of good work with the Black Caucus, who's supporting the veto override, and we look forward to having more conversations with folks about the work we do. So you can sign up for our email alerts, which will tell you when we need you to contact our lawmakers. It really, really helps because they're used to no one knowing what they do and no one contacting them. So if you actually are in their ear or in their email inbox or calling them, that really creates the pressure we need to get these policies changed. So if you just sign up for our email blast, that will give you all the inside information about how you can be part of changing the political dynamics here in Maryland.
Thank you so much, Lawrence. And I'm going to let you go in just a minute, but I do want to double down on what you're saying, what that the everyday citizen can do. One, they can go to lbsbaltimore.com. That's correct, right?
Yeah.
And your the website, well, the email blast, everything that I have actually utilized it before. It does make it pretty easy to actually contact your representatives. So thank you for that. I mean, that's the type of infrastructure that I like to see. To for especially for the everyday person who doesn't understand or how to even get to Annapolis physically. Let's start there. And we know a lot of Baltimoreans. We don't we kind of tend to stay in our city and we don't travel much. But you have definitely made it a lot easier for people to advocate on their own behalf. So thank you for that. The last thing I actually wanted to ask you was about AI policy.
Oh yeah,
Does
yeah.
LBS intend on touching on that?
We just had a conversation on that last week. And we're like,
Okay.
yeah, this is one of those things where there's particularly in terms of energy cost. So there's this battle happening where the Republicans are trying to get you to believe that energy prices are going up because of solar power and wind power. And that's not the reality. The reality is when you're on the internet, when you go to a website, that data that you're getting for the website is held on a server somewhere, on like a big facility full of computers, and you just access
Mhm.
that data via your phone or your computer. Now, with artificial intelligence, they're using way more than the regular internet in terms of computing power. Because every time you type something into Google now, it has to do this massive calculation of translating your question into something that AI can give you an answer to, as opposed to just giving you a website. So that means they get more and more facilities full of computers. They're not full of people. They are not generating thousands of jobs that are permanent. They're literally just big warehouses full of computers. So these are not permanent jobs. But they want to build these data centers all over the country because AI is gobbling up so much computer power. And that is
Mhm.
increasing your energy bills right now. And sometimes they have to actually run more small power plants to fuel these data centers. And those power plants often run on natural gas, which then pollutes the air around the power plant, which is oftentimes in poor and black and brown communities. So there's real concern about increasing your energy bill from these data centers. There's concern about environmental justice from these data centers. But there's also a vision that says that the only hope we as a state have to generate tax revenue is begging Google or Amazon to come to our community and build these data centers that have almost no permanent jobs. They have construction jobs, but no permanent jobs because you're literally just running a giant air conditioner or running a water cooling system to keep these computers cool. And all the time, AI is, producing disinformation, producing propaganda. This is not something that's adding to our lives. It is just something they're trying to use to generate profit for digital corporations who have no interest in our everyday life. So the tying of our economy to AI would have environmental impacts, would have social impacts, and just really show basically almost there's no vision for actually the community to guide economic development. All we can do is
Mhm.
beg Google or Amazon to give us a little bit of tax revenue, but we're probably going to get some tax breaks to come to our state, which is going to dilute any tax revenue we get. So we don't think it's great policy. We think community needs to control technology and data the same way we need to control policing and we need to control human social services, and we need to have a vision of economic development that does not depend upon begging Apple or Google or Amazon to build giant warehouses of computers in our state that are going to jack up our energy bills because we can hope to get some tax money from them in the future. But we need to have a vision of economic development that can replace that because right now, black lawmakers are saying, well, they're either going to build in the PG or they're going to build in the Montgomery County. I'd rather have them build in the PG because then we can at least get some tax revenue. So that's the trap we're in. So we need to figure out
Mhm.
other economic development systems to get us out of that trap. Because as long as we're in that trap, like we're all going to lose. Like we're all just going to try to give more and more tax breaks to more and more corporations to build bigger and bigger data centers, and we're going to be left paying for the energy they suck up in those data centers. It's going to make life less affordable for all of us. So we're trying to figure out, learn more about it because energy is a scientific issue, like solar energy, wind energy. It literally is science, and we have scientific anxiety in our community. But I think that we should trust ourselves and do the research to realize, well, at least when we're being lied to, when someone's trying to sell us a bill
Mhm.
of goods about how good something is for us economically or scientifically. So we should at least trust ourselves, do the education to know when we're being lied to, but challenge ourselves to get more expertise about what a energy and economic development system will look like that actually harnesses solar power or wind power or our natural resources to benefit us and not benefit just Google and Amazon.
You're absolutely right. Well, thank you. I hope that you also do some information sessions on that in the future because I have, in my very rudimentary way, I have been saying that this is going to be a problem. This is going to be a danger that's coming down the pipe. And it seems to be a conversation that people are not too keen to have right now, largely because they don't understand it and things are moving so
Yeah.
fast.
I,
But I don't.
mhm.
I think that is going to be our next fight for the next 20 years, and we have an opportunity here not to have the next Henrietta Lacks situation, not to have the next Johns Hopkins situation if we actually do take on this issue.
Yeah. 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 I mean, it's definitely something we're thinking about, and it's something we'll definitely talk about next year. But we don't like to talk about something
Mhm.
unless we have something clearly we want to tell people to do about it. So I think that's for us is the
Okay.
challenge is we just want to talk about it We want to have something clear that we can have at least some kind of action to move on it. But we got to be sure the action makes sense and is doable, and we can give people some vision about how to actually move from point A to point B on that. So it's definitely something we're trying to figure
I got you. Well, me personally, I'm trying to be a part of the think tank, so
out.
give me some marching orders. I'll do some research. But anyway, thank you so much, Lawrence, for being on the show today. I really enjoyed this conversation. You have given me a lot to think about and a lot of information. So really, really thank you, and continue to do the great work that you do at LBS.
I appreciate that. One thing, real quick, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention we have two podcasts, both on the Black Liberation Media Network. So you go to In Search of Black Power. It's like national, international policy book reviews. You can find it on YouTube, Spotify, Apple. You can also check out Political Commentary Corner, which is more state and local policy. You can find that YouTube, Spotify, Apple podcast. But again, check out Black Liberation Media. That's like a place on YouTube where a bunch of Black radicals have conversations, a bunch of YouTube shows that share the same YouTube page. So you can find our stuff and a lot of really good stuff there. So yeah, I appreciate you making time for this conversation. And if you want to look me up, I'm Neo Nubian or Lawrence Grandpre on all the relevant social media sites.
All right, thank you, and there you have it. All right, thanks, Lawrence.
All right, thank
Bye.
you.